Welcome back. Our guest this week is Democratic candidate for State Attorney General Dana Nessel. Our lead story, the state police director huddles with the Black Caucus, and heating up, the no-fault car insurance debate. On the OTR panel, Kathy Gray, Emily Lawler, and Bill Ballinger. Sit in with us as we get the inside out, off the record.
Production of Off the Record is made possible in part by a grant from Truscott Rossman, Michigan's only bipartisan strategic communications firm serving statewide, national, and international clients from their offices in Lansing, Detroit, and Grand Rapids. TruscottRossman.com. Hager Fox Heating and Air Conditioning Company, serving the greater Lansing area since 1941, providing solutions and choices for home comfort during all Michigan seasons. Hager Fox and Bryant, whatever it takes. HagerFox.com. And by MSU College of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Michigan State University wants to be a trusted partner in conversations about food and where it comes from, including its impact on our health and on our planet. Learn more at food.msu.edu. And now, this edition of Off the Record with Tim Scooby.
All right, welcome back to Off the Record. Well, an interesting week this week. The Colonel spoke to the media briefly after meeting with the Black Caucus. Let's see how that came down. Governor Snyder started this morning still getting flack for the remarks from his state police director and the criticism that her initial apology did not go to the content of her comments, that those football players were unpatriotic to take a knee during the national anthem. Well, she never addressed the issue, did she?
Tim, people can slice and dice things many different ways, but she came out and I thought she apologized with sincerity.
During a one-hour session with 4 members of the Legislative Black Caucus, the Colonel did apologize for her remarks and apologized again after calling it a productive meeting.
Obviously, my comments on a personal Facebook post was very offensive, and I am truly sorry. That was never my intent. We have some work to do with our minority populations, but if I offended anyone, I'm truly sorry.
Will you resign?
I am not resigning.
This former law enforcement officer and state senator called for her to resign before the meeting and did not change his stance afterwards.
My position has not changed, although I do think that the colonel is very remorseful.
Are you appeased?
I wouldn't go that far.
You trust her?
So far from what I've seen, I think there's a trust that we will continue to discuss these issues.
The Black Caucus has agreed to continue discussions with the governor. For his part, he says he doesn't agree with what the colonel said about those football players. All right, so Emily, has the administration turned the corner on this story?
Somehow not yet, which you'd think just given the news cycles they should have been able to. But, I think they're in the position of wanting to give the Legislative Black Caucus kind of a voice in the issue. And also, you can't just dismiss this as a one-off thing when there are such deep undertones of our policing and their interaction with minority communities.
I think coming out of the media, the tone from the African-American members of the Democratic Caucus was significantly different, even though they're sticking to the thing that she should resign. I think they were, I'm not saying they gave her the benefit of the doubt, but they listened and they think they heard a strong apology there.
Well, the problem that she has is that she's still saying, I'm sorry if I offended anybody.
What should she say?
I'm sorry. That it was the wrong thing to do.
If you were, not if you were offended, those of you that were offended.
Right. And because there are a lot of people who were offended, black, white, whatever, football players, non-football players. It was a really harsh thing that she put on her Facebook page, saying in there that these are people who hate America and who are exercising their First Amendment right. So saying, I'm sorry if I offended anybody is not the right message.
Well, I think if she continues to meet with the Black Caucus, they indicated she had told them she would continue the conversation, because I think it's important for them to show their constituencies, the African-American population, we're in control of this. We've got the state police chief kind of reporting to us, and we're going to have an ongoing dialogue. If that goes on like that and she satisfies them in that way, it'll probably peter out. Question is, will she really meet with him again? Let's just see what happens.
I don't think she has a choice.
Well, let's find out. I think if what Kathy says is correct, and she actually really doesn't necessarily disagree with what she said, but she's got to put a happy face on it and say, well, I'm sorry if I offended people, that isn't usually quite as strong as an apology needs to be.
Did she need to stand there and take some questions?
From us? You know, I think that answering reporters' questions would be helpful in this scenario. You know, if you have nothing to hide, if you have truly put this behind you, you should be able to answer questions about what happened, why it happened, and what you're going to do to stop it from happening again. She was not available for any of that and just said flat out she's not resigning. You know, it seems like the governor has really taken a strong stance on her not resigning either, so I'm interested to see where these discussions go. Obviously, the governor is not inviting the legislative Black Caucus in to help fire her. He's inviting them in to try to reach some common ground. 2
quick points. She is in the DROP program, which is the kind of early out for state cops, and she's done in February. She could get out of there. The word that I heard is that she was going to do the drop out, okay, and then the next day the governor was going to reappoint her to finish out the term. The question is was that on the table? Okay, I confirmed it from a pretty good source. And secondly, would they follow through on that? Also, here's what the administration was saying after the meeting. They wanted to put in context of her mental state when she posted this on Facebook. She was drafting the eulogy for a state trooper who had just died. And so she's in the midst of this trooper having served his state and having lost his life, and then this story pops up on the internet and she responds as she did. That is the context for what her state of mind was. She has not said that publicly, but I got it from a good source that that's what they're saying was going on behind the scenes.
Well, that's plausible, and a good way out perhaps for the administration, for Snyder and for her, would be when February comes and she drops, he doesn't reappoint her, and that's it.
We'll get a chance to ask him at some point. All right, no-fault car insurance, moving along, singing a song.
Moving along at a very slippery pace. It seemed to get even worse for passage this week after these hearings. We're finding out all sorts of things about this legislation, that the savings aren't really there for, or aren't guaranteed for, some of the higher levels of coverage if people want that higher level of coverage. That a lot of money is going to be shifted onto Medicaid when people reach their limits on the personal injury coverage. And the bottom line is it's still substandard coverage for people who are going to be still paying really high rates.
In the rollout of this, the number that came out was a 40% rate reduction. We all heard that. Right. Okay, well, come to find out, if you keep your unlimited coverage, what do you get as a rate rollback?
Zero.
Okay. Yeah. If you buy the 250, you get maybe 20% or whatever. Right. I don't think they misled us, okay, in the initial news conference, but they just didn't share all of the information. Okay, so is this thing in trouble?
Oh, big time. Leonard himself, the speaker, says I need 15 Democrats, and right now he's way short of that.
What are you hearing, Em?
Yeah, I mean, I think the whip count, it's no secret, isn't there yet on this issue. There are some minor tweaks that they could potentially make, but I don't know if wholesale those tweaks are going to get at the issue of what Kathy said. I mean, the people who want to keep their coverage, their current coverage that they already have, that is the most expensive in the nation, will pay the same or maybe even more, depending on if that pool shrinks and the cost to be in it goes up.
The other story that I picked up this week is some threats have begun to enter the debate. Some members of the, apparently, of the Democratic caucus have gone to their leader and said, the mayor is sort of talking about maybe putting a primary opponent against us, sort of stuff. And the mayor's office is not going to issue a press release that they're doing this. Why are you shaking your head?
Well, I'm just saying that's bad news for the mayor if they're making that kind of a threat.
Well, that's the speculation, okay? Yeah. And his people say no, but you know how this game is played. All right, and I've also picked up last night that the Democratic leader in the House may be making some allegations to his members of his own that you could be punished if you vote yes on this thing. So this thing is starting to get ugly.
It's starting to unravel. you know, Mayor Mike Duggan came up in the Ed McNamara era, and he is a hardball politician. So that does not surprise me at all that if those types of threats are being made. And I don't know about the other side, but the questioning during hearings this past week got increasingly contentious from Democrats that this just isn't providing the substantial relief that people need. Especially the people who are living in urban areas who are paying the highest rates in the nation.
And none of us should be surprised by this at all, because we have a 20-year record of seeing this movie once
even
before.
More than 20, 40. I mean, we've been talking about this for weeks. I've said all along, I think this thing is almost dead in the water from the start, and it's already perhaps floundering and splashing around, ready to go down for the count.
And as this keeps floundering, you know, you start to look at Meekoff's proposal, which is basically, I think he's trying to get at a lot of the low-hanging fruit, not necessarily saying let's do cost savings right away. You start to look at that and say, well, maybe that's what can get through.
Yeah, the governor is not checking in on this. I asked him yesterday, I said, should we have a choice system? He said, well, I'm going to let the legislative process work its way, which is I'm sitting on the sidelines and I'm not venturing in this thing. It'll be interesting. All right, Tom Leonard, running for Attorney General, no surprise there.
No, it's been rumored for quite a while, and it took him a while to get there, to make the announcement. I thought he would have done it before the Mackinac Conference a couple of weekends ago, but he did come out today. He's a fighter for the people. He's worked for the Genesee County Prosecutor's Office, worked for the Attorney General's Office for a couple of years, so he thinks he's uniquely qualified to and ready on day one.
Emily?
Yep, I spoke with him as well. That's essentially what he told me. But, you know, he has laid out some priorities that are different from the ones that Schuette's taken on. He wants to focus a lot on elder abuse, the opioid crisis, which I think Schuette has weighed in on a little bit, and then continue some of the things that Schuette's started, like human trafficking work. So, you know, it could be an interesting evolution of the office.
Tanya Schuetmacher, a Republican from West Michigan, is also in this thing,
Right.
but I think the town anoints him as the front runner from the opening bell.
Well, the town apparently here, meaning Lansing, the state capital, seems to have done that. And by the way, Burr's newsletter did take a poll on Mackinac Island, and it showed Leonard with a 2-to-1 lead over Schuetmacher among the people up there, for what that's worth. I think it's still, though, not automatically a slam dunk that Leonard is going to be the nominee. I think Schuetmacher is a plausible candidate. Maybe somebody else will get in. I mean, this is a year to go.
They leaned on her to stay out of this race.
Well, and they're trying to get her to perhaps be a lieutenant governor running mate for a male Republican nominee, gubernatorial candidate, and she's basically said, no, you're not going to buy me off with that. I'm going to stay in this. And I think she's smart, because if she runs well and strongly for this nomination against Leonard, she can make an even stronger case that, okay, if you're not going to nominate me at a convention for Attorney General, I would be your best lieutenant governor person.
All right, quickly, you did one of the town halls with Brian Calley in Detroit. How did it go?
There wasn't a great turnout. There was about 35 people there, and 5 to 6 people were staff members of Lieutenant Governor Calley. This is a city that has an 85% majority African American, and there were 5 African Americans in the audience.
Does he get points for going to Detroit?
Oh, sure. Sure he does.
But no points for ringing the bell.
Well, I mean, they obviously didn't do a whole lot to try to get a lot of people out. And I don't think that there were a whole lot of Detroiters there. There were people who came in from Macomb County, who came from Oakland County, and from Outer Wayne, but there weren't a whole lot of Detroiters there.
And how many reporters?
Well, me.
Well, you are a reporter. We're not going to shout early. All right, let's call in our guest. Attorney Dana Nessel is the managing partner in the Nessel-Kessel law firm in Detroit, noted for her work on behalf of the LGBT community. She's a former assistant Wayne County prosecutor. Ms. Nessel is now a Democratic candidate for state attorney general. She holds an undergraduate degree from the U of M and her law degree from Wayne State. Former soccer player. All-state?
I was. It's a long time ago.
What position?
Forward.
Well, let's go back.
Striker.
I was striker, yeah.
All right, now that we got the sports stuff out of the way, let's cut to the chase. Emily.
Well, the first one's an easy one. Why are you in this race for Attorney General?
Well, I mean, I've spent a long time filing lawsuits against the Office of the Attorney General, and for quite some time I've just come to see that the office isn't what it once was in terms of what I think it should be representing, which is the interests of the people of the state of Michigan. And so I thought I could spend several more years filing lawsuits and claims against the Office of Attorney General, or I could simply run for it and seek to fill it with the values that I have and I think are shared by the majority of Michiganders.
So what kind of marks do you give Mr. Schuette then?
Well, I don't think I've ever given him particularly high marks. I have not been pleased at all with the way that he's run the office. And the things that he's chosen to focus on and the things that he's chosen to ignore, I find to be unacceptable. And I think, again, we've seen a really large drift from the days of Frank Kelly. When I was growing up, obviously, Frank Kelly was Attorney General for, decades and decades. And I really appreciated his stance on consumer protection, protecting the environment, what I thought to be was important in terms of his work protecting seniors. We know there's a lot of elder abuse and elder neglect, cons, scams, and other types of economic exploitation. I think those are very important.
Was Jennifer Granholm a good Attorney General during her 4 years?
I think she was. She just wasn't there very long. And it is hard, in all fairness, now that we have term limits, it's hard because you have somebody who was in the office for so many years. There's so many things he was able to develop over the course of many decades. It's hard when you don't have as much time, and she certainly didn't. She only had one term.
Well, she could have had two, but she chose to run for governor.
She did, but she continued a lot of Frank Kelly's policies that I thought were important.
People have used this office as a stepping stone. Obviously, Jennifer Granholm ran for office, Bill Schuette's running for office, Mike Cox was in the Republican primary after his tenure. Do you see this office as a political stepping stone for you, or do you see it as the end-all of what you'd like to do?
I see it certainly not as a political stepping stone. I want to be Attorney General, period. I think it's an incredibly important office. I don't think it should be utilized as merely a stepping stone. And I think what happens is that when you have people who view it that way, all of their decisions are politicized in a way that a prosecutor's office never should be. I don't think that a prosecutor should spend every moment of the day wondering, how's this going to play for my gubernatorial campaign? That's not meting out justice. And so I think it's very important that you have someone there who's acting as the top law enforcement official and not thinking of themselves as a future candidate for something else.
You said you're the only candidate of either party in this race who's not represented corporate interests. Is that right?
That's correct.
So your opponent for the Democratic nomination, Patrick Miles, he falls into that category?
Well, he's a corporate lobbyist, so I think so.
He was a corporate lobbyist.
I believe that is his position right now. And I know that he spent many years, obviously, representing Fortune 500 companies. My background is not like that at all. I spent many years as an assistant prosecutor in Wayne County. I have represented crime victims in every kind of criminal case you can imagine. I've prosecuted murderers and serial rapists and child abusers and domestic abusers. So, I have a lengthy history of that, but unlike anyone else running for this office, I've also been at the other table. So I have represented indigent defendants. I understand the needs of the community. I understand what's important in terms of the criminal justice system having two different sides. I mean, it's critically important, but again, I've done a tremendous amount of civil rights work as well. And, in concert with Kim Worthy, we have the most effective anti-hate crimes task force probably in the entire nation. So I have a wide variety of work that many of the other candidates simply don't have.
Patrick Miles was a U.S. attorney for Western Michigan, so he was a prosecutor too. Couldn't he say, well, I have experience on kind of different sides too? Maybe it doesn't hurt if you're Attorney General to have some knowledge of the corporate world, right?
Right, and I'm not saying that it does. I think that what's unfortunate about it is that when you have so many people running for office that have such close ties and such close connections to big corporations, I think it's concerning when a lot of cases, I believe, ought to be brought against bad actors in the corporate community. And frankly, we have an AG in office right now that I've seen doing commercials for products that have been investigated by AGs in other states. And that's very worrisome to me. And I think it's important, of all positions there are, I think it's most important for the Attorney General not to be beholden to corporate interests.
Were crimes committed in the Flint water crisis?
That remains to be seen. I think that probably there were, I mean, certainly there were crimes committed, there's no question. But if you're talking about the individual actors that have been prosecuted, I'm not familiar enough with the specific evidence in each and every case, but I do have a lot to say about how those cases were prosecuted. I'm quite frankly very disturbed with the fact that you have an Attorney General who says that because of a conflict of interest, he cannot he himself cannot have his office prosecute these matters, and yet he assigns this to a special prosecutor who is one of his biggest donors, a person who actually donated so much money that I believe in the last election cycle he had to be refunded a portion of that.
This is Todd Flood.
It is Todd Flood. And someone who was also a big contributor to Governor Snyder, who ostensibly should have been a target, potentially, of the prosecution. And so you have some $5 million that has now been paid to this private law firm. Todd, I believe, is billing at $4.50 an hour. There's no prosecutor in the state. There's no prosecutor in the nation that makes $450 an hour on a no-bid contract. Jeff Sessions does not make $450 an hour. So here we have $5 million that's gone into this handful of prosecutions, while you still have people in the city of Flint that don't have clean drinking water and whose pipes have never been, fixed at this point. And I think it's a travesty that there's no reason that the prosecutions should have continued in this fashion. It's
he should
not
have handled
appropriate.
it all within his office.
I'm not saying he should handle it within his office. I'm saying he shouldn't have contracted it out in a no-bid process to one of his donors. Generally, when you have this happen, the AG will assign, if you have a conflict in a prosecutor's office, it should go normally to another prosecutor's office. Now, I understand that there were complications because, the extensive nature of this particular event called for, more resources than you would normally need. But if that's the case, then you go through the legislature, you get some resources that are allocated. Maybe you use retired prosecutors or retired judges, not people who have some sort of bias potentially. And you add 5 or 6 people, to an office, and you allow, for instance, Genesee County to actually prosecute these cases, as opposed to having someone who says they're recused, but then I always see Bill Schuette standing right next to Todd Flood announcing anything that happens on the cases.
The Genesee County prosecutor is in on this. he's totally supportive of everything Schuette and Flood are doing. They're side by side at every press conference.
Well, I guess it's hard for me to understand why there aren't people actually from his office that are prosecuting this, and why you have a special prosecutor who, again, seems to have some conflicts himself and who's being paid so much more money than any other prosecutor.
How long do you think this thing is likely to play out?
Well,
will it be done by a year from now, just before the election, or not?
It seemingly has dragged out for a very long time. Now, to be fair, I'm used to something we call the rocket docket in the Frank Murphy Hall of Justice, where cases frequently, they're issued one day, and then, by court order, by the Supreme Court's order, they're to be finished 90 days later. Now, most cases are not going to proceed that quickly, but theoretically, the cases shouldn't drag out that long, but because I consider some of them to potentially be nothing more than show trials, I think that the special prosecutor will find a way to drag them out in a manner.
So you think this is a show trial that maybe helps Schuette?
I'm concerned that that is an issue, and I thought it was interesting because I read that both Frank Kelly and Maura Corrigan had issues with some of the prosecutions, and I thought, what an interesting combination of people to both say, I have an issue with this, and that gives me pause and some concern.
Now, the race for Attorney General is very different than other types of races. You've got to go through the Democratic Convention. What types of things are you doing to reach out to the party regulars?
Well, I'm going around the state and I'm meeting with different Democratic clubs and different caucuses. There's also something interesting that's developed just in the last year, and really since the November election. You have all kinds of people from around the state that didn't necessarily consider themselves to be Democrats prior to November 2016, but they do now. And they've gotten very involved, actually, with the party. And so I'm meeting with people who a year ago didn't even call themselves Democrats, but now I expect that in 2018 we're going to see them at the convention.
A hypothetical. Let's assume we have a woman at the top of the ticket running for governor. Let's assume we have a woman running for Secretary of State. Can the party afford for diversity to have a woman be the AG candidate?
Well, a couple things about that.
Have you thought about that?
I have thought about that. And, firstly, I think that, women are vastly underrepresented in state office. I think that in the legislature we have only 20% of the legislature is actually female legislators. And so we have a history of a lack of representation. I think there are a lot worse things that could happen than to have more women on the ticket. And I will tell you that I was at the Democratic Convention in 2014 when we nominated all men, and I didn't hear anybody complaining then. So I know that women are winning in special elections, not just in Michigan, but around the country. Women are supporting other women financially in ways that we've never seen before. And if ever there was a time where I think the state was ready for that, I think it's now. And I think not only will an all-female ticket potentially not be a drag on the ticket, I think it could be a boon to the ticket. And
have you talked to Ms. Whitmer about this?
I haven't talked to her personally about it.
Is she your candidate for governor?
I think that Gretchen Whitmer would be a very strong candidate for governor.
She might be a strong candidate, but is she your candidate?
Well, I have supported her in the past, and I certainly have no plans to deviate from that.
Do you think the delegates to this convention are likely to pick up your argument and say, hey, look, let's stop worrying about ticket balancing, gender, racial, just go for the best person?
Well, obviously that's what I hope, but I will say this as well. I find it interesting that I'm asked almost on a daily basis about the fact that I'm a woman, and no one seems very interested in the fact that I am the first openly gay person to run for statewide office. So I sort of bring a different type of diversity and a representation for at least 500,000 Michiganders that we've never had at the statewide level before. And so I do bring a different diversity to the ticket than we've ever seen.
You'll stay for overtime?
I will.
Let's do that. All right, we'll take a quick break here. Come back to WKAR.org for more of our conversation.
Production of Off the Record is made possible in part by a grant from Truscott Rossman, Michigan's only bipartisan strategic communications firm serving statewide, national, and international clients from their offices in Lansing, Detroit, and Grand Rapids. TruscottRossman.com. Hager Fox Heating and Air Conditioning Company, serving the greater Lansing area since 1941, providing solutions and choices for home comfort during all Michigan seasons. Hager Fox and Bryant, whatever it takes. HagerFox.com. And by MSU College of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Michigan State University wants to be a trusted partner in conversations about food and where it comes from, including its impact on our health and on our planet. Learn more at food.msu.edu. For more Off the Record, visit WKAR.org. Michigan Public Television stations have contributed to the production costs of Off the Record with Tim Skubic.
Counselor, we're going to do our overtime, and Kath, why don't you start us off?
One of the things you're most best known for is your defense of the same-sex marriage case in the U.S. Supreme Court. How is that going to impact your race and your role as Attorney General?
Well, I hope that people will think of me as a fighter for the underdog, which is how I've always seen myself and my role in the legal system. And I've never shied away from a case, as you know, as all of you here know. That was a case that, was not brought by an LGBT rights organization or a civil rights organization. I brought it along with some other private attorneys because we believed in the case. And even though we were told, you're not going to win this, you shouldn't bother, you're going to set back the cause. I believed in it, and I brought it, and I fought very hard for it and worked for free for many years on that because I wanted to see justice prevail. So I'm hoping that people will see that that is part of who I am and part of the reason I want to be Attorney General, because I want to fight for people who have been generally marginalized and underrepresented.
As you know, we had Mr. Miles on the show last week. He sat in that chair, so I want to ask the same quick questions of him, okay? Capital punishment?
I am absolutely opposed to capital punishment. I will say that as somebody who has prosecuted a number of people who have been convicted of homicide and also represented people, mistakes happen. And when you have capital punishment, you cannot correct those mistakes later on. And so for that reason, I'm very opposed to it.
If you were AG today, would you shut down Pipeline 5?
Yes, I would.
Without any reservation?
I think we've had more than enough studies on this issue. This is potentially the biggest ecological and economic catastrophe that our state will ever see, and we absolutely can't risk it. I think it needs to be shut down. It needs to be shut down right away.
Legalized pot?
Favor. I absolutely support legalization of marijuana, and I will say, again, in my experience as a prosecutor, as a defense attorney, somebody who's done a lot of civil asset forfeiture work, I think it's time to legalize. All of the deaths and the mayhem that I've seen caused as a result of marijuana occur on the black market. And I think that this is an excellent proposal. I think it's very in-depth. It's been worked on for years. I think it's actually the most, it covers all the bases, is what I'm going to say about this proposal. And I think it's not only going to be helpful, you know, in terms of the roads and schools and even helping veterans who have post-traumatic stress disorder, but I think it's time to stop putting people in prison for marijuana and for it to be properly regulated, and that's what this proposal will do.
All right, you saw his performance last week, and you saw him not answer some of those same questions. What did you make of that?
Well, the only problem I have, and I'm not talking about this specifically as to Mr. Miles, but I mean to political candidates in general, and particularly for the office of the Attorney General, when I don't know what a person's position really is on something, it concerns me in terms of their ability to implement and to enforce the law. Because if I don't know if they really agree or disagree with something, it's concerning to me. And that's why I'm being as open and honest as possible that I do expect to see marijuana, legalization of recreational marijuana on the ballot in 2018. I think they're actually getting close to having the requisite number of signatures. And absolutely, without hesitation, I support it.
So is your experience as a lesbian and also defending the LGBT community, is that an asset for you seeking this nomination, running the election? Do you think, would there be any reason people would pay that much attention to your record if you didn't have that credential in your portfolio?
Well, I think it adds to my credentials. Obviously, as I've indicated, I have a very long-standing record as it pertains to representing crime victims and also, again, doing defense work and all kinds of civil rights work, not just those involving the LGBT community. But that being the case, I will say that, you know, there are so many people in the LGBT community that are really clamoring for proper representation, and they're tired of having the office of the Attorney General use them as a punching bag. So I think it would be great to have someone in this office that is going to protect the LGBTQ community instead of trying to persecute them.
As I understand it, the Democrats are planning to make their nomination next spring, like 4 months earlier than they have been.
In April, I expect.
Does that help, do you think, you? What do you think about that?
I don't know that it helps or hurts. It means I have a lot of work to do, and I'm very tired.
Well, it's before the primary, for one thing. You don't even know necessarily who your gubernatorial nominee is going to be.
No, that's very true. So it may complicate things a little bit. There's a mechanism, actually, that allows for the party to decide not to endorse anyone for this race or for the other down-ballot races. So they could potentially say, we're not going to endorse anyone at this time. I don't expect that to be the case. I think there will be an endorsement.
Well, there's got to be a formal nomination at some point.
In August, there's a formal nomination.
At the convention.
Yeah. At the convention,
that
that's
would
by
be your
statute.
preference, wouldn't it?
No, not necessarily. I think that it's important that we have nominees who are the endorsed candidate who have a longer period of time. You know, it's just so little time. But what I've seen in the past, and I don't think this has worked very well for the Democrats, certainly, is you'll have a candidate that no one has even thought about for a particular office who's suddenly selected and might be mid-August. And now you only have till the beginning of November to campaign as a candidate for that office. So I think this provides the Democrats with a lot more time to be able to do that. So I think it's good for the party.
You said in your campaign announcement that the Attorney General's office had lost its way. You've talked a little bit about the things they've been overzealous on. What have they not been doing that you see as the role of the Attorney General's office?
Well, so the AG has to file annual reports on the kind of work that they're doing. And you see, when you look at the difference between Frank Kelly being in office and now, there is a tremendous decrease in the number of consumer protection cases that have been filed. And that is deeply concerning to me. So, I mean, that is an area that is hugely important to me. And that I think the office really needs to be focused on. And as I have previously indicated, I think there was a report that was just released in the last few weeks that almost a quarter of all nursing homes have serious violations, occupational and health violations, quality of care violations, and that is horrific to me. And this is the province of the Attorney General. They ought to be helping seniors. And I talk to county prosecutors all the time that just feel helpless because they simply don't have the resources to go into each and every nursing home, each and every assisted facility in order to, make certain that seniors are being properly cared for. So that's something that I think is incredibly important. Schuette hasn't done it. I will.
Counselor, in light of your comments about Mr. Flood and Mr. Schuette, the, quote, potential bias there because of the political contributions, what is your policy on accepting money from attorneys?
Well, I mean, I certainly do have attorneys who are going to be contributing to my campaign. There's no question about that. And I think that the way the system generally works is the first people who are interested in supporting you are the people you know. It just so happens that since I'm an attorney, those are the people I know. Now, I don't know a lot of CEOs because I don't work in that field. But for instance, I know a lot of prosecutors. I know a lot of cops. I know a lot of teachers and nurses. And these are the people who I expect to be my supporters.
All right, so the Attorney General's office has the right to get in outside counsel to work on some cases. That's a long history in the AG's office. Mr. Kelly did it. So would you have a rule that if somebody contributed to you, you would not hire them for outside work through your office?
Well, I mean, I think I'd have to look at the specific circumstance. I think that the case that we're talking about, when I mentioned Flint, I mean, you had a situation where the person who was being paid an extraordinary amount of money for this, one of the potential suspects, one of the targets, was someone he had also given a lot of money to. It just, I think for appearance's sake, it looks terrible, and I think there are just a lot of other ways that could have been done.
So
where
if you
people
paid an outside
so
attorney $100 an hour rather than $450, that would be okay?
Well, actually, it would be a lot more fair, wouldn't it? And it'd be more fair to the taxpayers.
Would there still be the
state?
appearance of a conflict?
Well, I mean, doesn't it almost appear as though somebody's being paid off when they're being paid, triple or 4 times the amount that an attorney would
say that's what
normally
I'm
be
worth. I'm a good attorney. I'm worth every penny.
Well, maybe the state should shop around a little bit then and see if we can find somebody of comparable abilities that isn't so crazy expensive. I've never heard of anybody working either as a prosecutor or even a criminal defense attorney that bills $450 an hour. I mean, most corporate attorneys don't bill that way.
We've talked a lot about former attorneys general. One name we haven't mentioned was Mike Cox,
right,
who was there for 8 years, and he was once in the Wayne County Prosecutor's Office. Did you work with him? So what did you think of Mike Cox in the prosecutor's office and as Attorney General?
Well, I always got along with Mike. We never had any issues between us.
Mike Duggan liked him.
That's true. They seem to be pretty close, and I worked for Mike Duggan too. I think it's just a matter of priorities in that office. And again, what I saw happening under Cox and what I saw the continuation of under Schuette is I saw them taking on a lot of types of cases that traditionally were in the province of the 83 county prosecutors' offices and the 2 U.S. attorneys' offices. Now, my suspicion is because the Republicans who were in office didn't want to go after corporate entities. And that's why they stopped focusing on things like the environment and senior protection and consumer protection. And instead, they started doing a lot of the same things and a lot of the same functions that you already had prosecutors all around the state handling. And sometimes they were actually competing for similar funds in order to be able to prosecute those kinds of matters. So I don't want to just be an office that duplicates what the other offices are already doing. Now, I want to make certain that those offices have the proper amount of resources. And so especially when they ask for it, especially when those resources are required, I want to be able to say, hey, listen, the state's going to come and help you out with that. If you need somebody who is a real specialist in the area of child and sexual abuse, and you have to be forensically trained in that, and you're a smaller county, and perhaps you have somebody who's sort of a serial pedophile, and there's a lot of different cases, of course I want the Office of the Attorney General to be able to assist in those cases, and all kinds of other cases that are multi-jurisdictional.
Are you the governor's attorney, if elected?
I would not be the governor's attorney. Obviously, you would be representing the state of Michigan and you know, the state executive offices. But to say that the AG is the governor's attorney, that's not how I view the office.
The governor has his own legal counsel.
He does.
Right. But you would consult with, if the governor called up and said, hey, would you come over and let's talk about case X, Y, or Z, you would do that?
Absolutely. I think that's part of your job.
And would you give him or her advice?
If they asked for it, absolutely.
Is it wrong for the state to be subsidizing the legal defense of all these people, let's say, in the Flint water crisis?
Yeah, I mean, I do have a lot of problems with that, you know, because there are lots of times you see when you have, for instance, police officers who don't have this in their union contract, or you have other kinds of municipal actors that are not always indemnified or not always represented by their municipality in terms of the attorneys that they are provided, and many times when they have to, you know, find their own lawyers. But you know, this is an instance, I guess, what's troubling to me is just the amount of money and how much these attorneys are billing to represent these people. And what bothers me so much, I mean, as someone who's represented, you know, indigent folks on some very serious cases, I mean, I want you to understand that attorneys often are paid $1,000 to $2,000 in some counties to defend somebody on a first-degree murder case. And yet, what we're seeing is people who are charged with crimes, many of them, you know, misdemeanors, and yet their attorneys are paid, you know, 100 times that. I mean, it just doesn't make sense to me why, for just the average typical person who doesn't have any money and who is charged with a very serious crime, their attorney gets paid so little by the state, but yet the attorneys representing these folks get paid such an extraordinary amount. I think that's something we really have to look into.
We have time for one more question.
The attorney generals in the states have been going after, you know, they went after the Obama administration quite a bit, and now that they're going after the Trump administration. If you were attorney general, do you think that you'd be jumping into a lot of the federal cases that are out there now? Absolutely.
I see this office as the last line of defense against the Trump administration and federal overreach in general. So on a litany of cases, in a litany of different departments, I definitely believe that this office needs to be utilized in order to fight back.
You'll keep us posted on your candidacy?
I will.
All right, thanks. Good to see you again.
Nice to see you.
Thanks for showing up. See you guys next week.